So welcome back for the afternoon. We've had a really wonderful start. Thanks to the entire team, Sabrina, Heather, Kara, Evan, Julia, and others who've done such a great job. And thank you to our panelists and speakers this morning. We've had a nice run of events the last 2 weeks here at UCLA. We started last week with Joanna Lewis from Georgetown talking about U.S.-China climate cooperation. China obviously plays a big, important role in this story, as you've already heard this morning. We had a talk on Monday with Jim Salzman and others talking about the challenges of moving fast on clean technology development, right? And that's a big challenge that hasn't been touched on as much today, but it's underlying this story of critical minerals as well. How do we move quickly given all of our various concerns and the competing interests? And then yesterday we had a deep dive from Eduardo Bitran, who you heard a lot from this morning as well, but we had an even deeper dive on the Chilean situation yesterday. And so to build on the really excellent start we had this morning, we are in this panel going to try to unpack global supply chains, dig a little bit deeper to understand the dynamics of critical minerals and global supply chains. And we're going to try to touch on it on several different levels, which in some ways were touched on in the morning session, but we're going to try to add to these discussions. We'll definitely talk about the geopolitical level, looking at the competition between the US, China, European countries, Korea, Japan. Touch on efforts of the US to reshore and friendshore and to capture larger parts of the value chain. We'll unpack a little bit more the dynamics of Chinese dominance in the supply chain. And we'll look at how other countries are trying to compete with the US and China. We'll also try to get down to talking more about the countries that have the reserves of these minerals, right? This is both provides opportunities and risks. We've heard quite a bit about Chile already, but we'll touch on other countries as well. You think Congo and cobalt, Indonesia with nickel and others, and try to unpack exactly what's happening in these places, how these countries are trying to capture more of the value chain, and how are they dealing with the potential environmental impacts of things. And then we'll also get into a bit about the companies that are navigating this. Who are the main actors in the supply chains, and how are they thinking about their role in all of this? So we have an all-star panel today. Let me briefly introduce them. Sir Ernest Scheider is a senior correspondent for Reuters. These days he's covering clean energy, the clean energy transition and critical minerals, but you covered in the past fracking and oil and gas. And he has a book out called The War Below, Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. Here it is. Everywhere. Buy a copy. Available everywhere. Yeah. Next, we have Anne Clawson. She's the head of government affairs and public policy at Cascade Advisory, and she's has done a lot of work. These days, she does a lot of work with corporations, but also comes from the corporate sector herself, working at Alcoa in the past, and she advises these days corporations, trade associations, and consultancies. And then next we have Gracelin Baskaran. She's the research director and senior fellow for energy security and climate change program at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the major think tanks in Washington, D.C. She's a mining economist, and her primary expertise is in critical minerals trade and emerging markets, and she's been very much in the mix in these debates in D.C. inside the Beltway, and we'll look forward to hearing from her. And finally, at the end, is my old friend Jingjing Zhang, who's an environmental lawyer from China and an advocate. We used to work together at NRDC. She has been called in the press China's Erin Brockovich. Her role in the past was suing polluters domestically in China, but these days she's founded and heads an NGO that works to look at, to create greater accountability for Chinese companies operating in clean technology supply chains. So she's done a lot of work traveling to Africa and other global south countries. Okay, so I think in terms of format, we're going to do something pretty similar to panel one. I think that worked very successfully. So I'll ask some opening questions and have our panelists give about 8 minutes each of their initial comments, and then we'll do a similar kind of 2 minutes, 1 minute, 2 minutes question with 2 minutes from an initial responder, and then with up to 1 minute from the others to comment. I thought that worked well, created a lot of energy and interactivity. So we'll give that a try. Okay, so let's get started then. Let's dive right in. So Ernest, you've written a book on critical minerals, right? And one of the things you deal with in the book is this issue of trade-offs and choices. So maybe we can just start there and tell us how you see this issue from that perspective.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, to me, this whole issue around the critical minerals and the energy transition revolves around the idea of choice. What are the choices we're willing to make if we want the transition? Where are there places too special to mine? Are there places too special to mine? And what are the standards by which we allow mining? And my day job at Reuters and in the book, I've dove into projects specifically in the United States, but elsewhere in the world as well. But I wanted audiences in the US especially to have to grapple with this reality of how we're going to get the building blocks for all of these pieces of equipment that we want and that power our everyday lives. You know, it was only 4 years ago this month that the world discovered the coronavirus pandemic, and also that masks really weren't made in the United States. And that's just one basic piece of necessary equipment. But when you extrapolate it to all these other electronic gadgets and gizmos, cell phones, laptops, wind turbines, et cetera, then you really start to get the question, okay, where are places that we want to allow mining? And the geopolitical angle here is huge, because for too long we've exported the production of a lot of these minerals, and China, as the previous panel said, has really cornered the market on a lot of the production of these areas right now, and using it as an economic weapon. And it's had some really interesting overlays. You know, we were talking about the Mountain Pass mine in the lunch seminar presentation. That was a mine that actually was bought out of bankruptcy a few years ago by a consortium that included a Chinese company and helped resuscitate that site. So a lot of the know-how right now for a lot of these for these critical mineral projects depends on Chinese technical know-how, because a lot of that is happening right now in mainland China. And so these are some of the areas that we really have to be thinking through as we decide where the United States and California and other states want to have their critical minerals production increase in a just and equitable way. And there are a lot of tension points around there. I mean, one of the main stories that I look at in the book is the story of the Rhyolite Ridge project in Nevada, about 200 miles north of Las Vegas. And this is a massive deposit of lithium that could supply much of the needs for Ford and other automakers. Unfortunately, this is a rare flower that's at this site found nowhere else on the planet. And so if you dig an open pit mine, the question is, will you destroy this flower? Will you destroy this ecosystem? And it brings up really interesting questions around biodiversity and what matters more to us. And if we did nothing to address climate change and just left the flower there alone, would not the flower go extinct anyhow? And so these are sort of interesting questions that we look at. There's also questions of indigenous rights. What's going on right now in Arizona with the Resolution Copper case is a huge tension point between the San Carlos Apache and two large international mining companies. And it was actually, last Friday we were preparing for this panel, and the ruling came down from the Ninth Circuit that basically ruled against the San Carlos Apache. So that actually is probably going to end up at the Supreme Court. And that there again lies up big questions. We know we need a lot of copper. We know we need a lot of lithium. You know, the first panel went into a lot of the nuts and bolts around that. The question is, where are we going to get these materials right now? I mean, we know that the Democratic Republic of the Congo is a huge producer of cobalt, and unfortunately sometimes you can have children be part of that supply chain via artisanal mining, and it's sort of a cute sounding phrase, but really it's basically common people that will break onto mine sites and start digging and then sell that rock into a supply chain, and it's really hard to trace. And so that's a huge, huge problem right now. And so are there standards by which we should hold mining companies to? One right now that I chronicle in the book is the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. It was founded in part by Tiffany & Company, the jeweler, and it works to audit and increase transparency in the global supply chain so that companies and consumers like me and you can know that when we buy a cell phone or a solar panel or an electric vehicle, that the minerals that went into there were not produced with child labor, and that the people were paid a living wage, and that water was not scarce in this operation. And so the more we have conversations around what are the choices that we as consumers want, the more we increase transparency in these supply chains, especially as we completely remake the idea of what it means to produce energy and to produce these building blocks for our world right now. And I would say that these tensions are increasingly being faced by countries across the world, not just in resource-rich or big consuming nations right now. And there are issues for all of us to grapple with. We recently saw in Panama, for instance, that a giant copper mine was essentially shut down. And people sort of think of Panama as a pretty stable regulatory regime country, but here's a massive supply of copper that is now offline. And the people there didn't want that, and that's their right. But the question now becomes, okay, well, here is a huge chunk of the global copper supply that's now offline, but we're going to need a lot more copper. I mean, I'm looking around this room right now. Most people have laptops. We all have cell phones. I'm talking to a microphone that's got a bunch of copper in it. All of this stuff has to come from somewhere. And so these are the questions that I think we really need to be thinking through, especially if we want to transition. And inaction is a choice as well.
Great, thanks so much. So next, I want to move on to Anne. So you've come from the corporate sector, and you now work with the corporate sector in your current role. So help us to understand the dynamics from your part of the world. How do you see this? And let's hear from you on that.
Yeah. Is this working? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I come from the corporate sector, and I come specifically from government affairs, which a lot of people tend to think of as like lobbying. But a lot of what government affairs is, at least for me, tends to be problem solving. So my portfolio when I was with a large corporation was a lot of the countries where we operated joint ventures. That was places like Guinea, Saudi Arabia, Suriname, and then I also had the portfolio managing China and China overcapacity issues. And so what I was really focused on was how do you operate in tricky environments, and how do you make choices that allow you to operate responsibly? So we've heard about the choices that we have to make as a society, and now I'd like to talk about how the clean energy transition has impacted how we think about companies and how they operate, companies and where they operate. And I'd also like to say that none of this is new, but it's also kind of very new. People have been mining forever, right? But the concept of critical minerals was, at least as it exists in the US, was kind of invented in 2018 as a concept. So there have been these existing trends, and we've either seen them accelerate or we've seen them be turned on their heads. And the first is resource nationalism. This is already something we've seen for quite some time. In China, they've got the resources they have. I think we saw some earlier slides about how China will have 40 or 60 or 80% of refining, but 3% of world reserves, because you can't really choose where minerals are located. So what China has done as it's ramped up its industrial capacity is it said, we need to get these minerals from somewhere to feed our refining capacity. And the country's been really strategic about doing that all around the globe. This had been happening before, but it really accelerated with the Belt and Road Initiative, which started in 2013. And we've been seeing Chinese companies securing rights to minerals in Latin America, in Africa, what that has done is it's meant that China's been able to feed its big manufacturing beast. At the same time, and I think we saw some allusions to this earlier, resource-rich, lower-income countries are saying, wait a minute, I don't want people to just take my dirt and ship it somewhere else to turn it into something. That's not going to create jobs. That's not good for our economy. So places like Indonesia, but also Ghana, Guinea, have said, wait a minute, you need to refine those minerals here. You need to develop our economy as well. And Indonesia has been the most successful example, and what they've actually done in a lot of cases is, and this has been kind of happening gradually, is they've said, well, actually, Indonesian companies have to have a majority stakeholder right to a lot of these mines, or a lot of the downstream resource projects. So that's attracted a lot of investment. Other countries have been a little less successful. We've seen richer countries do this too. Saudi Arabia is a great example. When I was with Alcoa invested in Saudi Arabia in 2009 because they were already saying, wow, we need to diversify away from oil. And so they saw aluminum as a great sector to diversify into. And they've been doing this increasingly. They've started a variety of critical minerals initiatives and different mining programs. So the resource nationalism was there, and if anything, the U.S. has been late to the picture. There have been choices that the U.S. has made that have made it this way. So we've got high energy costs, we've got high costs of labor that lead to high standards of living, right? So there are good things about this. But there are some trade-offs too that mean that we're a little bit late. So Mountain Pass has been mentioned a couple of times. One of the reasons that the Mountain Pass mine originally closed and went bankrupt is that until recent innovations, rare earth mining has been one of the most destructive types of mining you can do. It's you just have to go through. It's so dispersed throughout the soil that you really have to refine and refine and refine and refine, and it can be very damaging. So that's something we didn't want to do here, and so that's a choice that we made. And then another choice is that we're slow on permitting. The Resolution copper mine, that process has been ongoing for 26 years. And regardless of how it turns out and whether it goes to the Supreme Court and what that looks like, I could imagine that it might be helpful for companies to have certainty about what's going to happen with an investment they're going to make or not make in a less than 3-decade time frame. So those are some challenges we have in the U.S. as we do this. In terms of what's new, the conflict between the U.S. and China is obviously growing much hotter. And this has also changed how U.S. companies manage supply and demand. So prior to COVID and prior to the intensification of the conflict between U.S. and China, we had our supply-demand picture pretty well ironed out. I think the best case of this was the just-in-time manufacturing that auto manufacturers use. They were able to have parts show up like the day they had to be put on the production line. It was just a masterpiece in efficiency. And then, of course, COVID happened and it all fell apart. But another thing that happened was that the US government started to realize, wow, a lot of the benefits that China is accruing from its manufacturing might are things that we are not seeing here in the US. And we've actually, because of the government subsidies and because of some other, because of the choices that are being made in China, China is not correctly pricing the externalities, right, of a lot of its production. And so the US government said, and this was under the Trump administration, and you probably heard a lot about the tariffs, the US government said, well, we're just gonna put a whole bunch of tariffs on Chinese goods and it'll work itself out. And I think what we're finding now, and what's interesting with this administration, I'm looking forward to hearing what you say, is that we're realizing that that didn't quite work. And so now the question is, what can we do in addition to tariffs, or how can we tweak these to better level the playing field and to assure that we're all capturing those externalities correctly? And we're seeing some success, right? Just this past month, the data came out that for the first time in 20 years, Mexico is the largest importer of goods into the United States and not China. China had place number 1 for 20 years. So we're seeing some of those impacts, but we're not seeing the full thing. The other thing that's happening between the US and China is that we're getting really nervous about our access to these minerals, and it's not an academic nervousness. China has restricted access to some important critical minerals, all in the Gs, not sure about that, but graphite, germanium, gallium, have all had restrictions put on them. And those are all really important minerals that go into we haven't talked about them a lot today, but we need them in a lot of different things. So now what we're seeing is that this isn't just an economic, but it's a national security concern. Okay, so then, all of a sudden we care about this. The next thing we're seeing is changing demand profiles. I remember my first aha moment about the clean energy transition and resource demands. It was a presentation actually at CSIS from some World Bank researchers about a decade ago. The numbers were astonishing. So we've gone through them, but I'm gonna stick with lithium for a minute. The International Energy Agency has predicted that by 2040 we'll need 13 to 42 times more lithium than we use today. So first, even 13 times growth is massive. But second, what happens if we supply lithium for 42 times the growth and then we only need 13 times the growth, right? That's a big market failure. So you translate that into electric vehicles and it explains the headlines you're seeing. Car makers don't know how to handle this bumpy demand they're seeing. And so we're getting headlines like EV adoption is only growing at 50% a year, not 75% a year. It's just comical. And people are freaking out. They're like, oh no, it's collapsing. It's not collapsing. But that drop in demand means that prices for minerals are plunging. Lithium is down 67% year on year. So lithium companies are just hemorrhaging jobs. They're halting investments. Nickel dropped 45% in 3 months. So how do governments help companies deal with this price uncertainty? We've seen that Australia's put in special measures for nickel, but I think the big policy challenge is we know that in a couple decades there's this massive demand, but how do you keep American businesses, Australian businesses from going out of business before that demand ticks up? So the final thing I want to point out is that we're seeing some fascinating supply chain innovation, and some of it's going well, and some of it's not going so great. What we're seeing is that these automakers know that they need these new materials, but they're not sure how they're going to get it. China's saying, no, you can't have access to that. So they're like, I got it. How about if we, Ford, Stellantis, GM, buy some mines, which is not normal, and that's not how things have typically been done. So Stellantis is dropping $100 million a mine, $90 million for a 20% stake in an Argentinian lithium mine, $100 million in the controlled thermal resources mine just south of here. GM's putting $650 million in a Nevada mine. Ford, this is a choice, $4.5 billion in nickel processing in Indonesia with a Brazilian and a Chinese company. So what we're seeing is they're trying these new things, and it's going to secure supply, right? They've supplied their offtake, but some other things are also happening. Indonesia doesn't have great environmental controls on its mines, so Ford got the Financial Times front page treatment for its mine in Indonesia, which is not ideal. And Ford is also getting political backlash for its choice to license batteries from Chinese company CATL in Michigan. This has been making headlines a lot. They're going forward with it, but it's under a lot of pressure and scrutiny. And none of this is to name or shame any companies. They're all trying new things. I think what we're seeing is that what worked in the past is not working now, and we don't know what's working now. So people don't have the answers, companies don't have the answers, and they're trying new things, and that's really exciting.
Terrific. So we're going to go now to Jingjing next. That's a good segue to talk about what she's seeing on the ground. She spent a lot of time in Africa and other places. If we could get help with getting her PowerPoint on the screen here, perfect. And so I'll hand it over to Jingjing, and then we'll go to Gracelin after that.
Okay, I will start provide my perspective, understand this issue on the critical minerals. First, start the question: the critical mineral, critical to whom and to how long? And this is a question I have been asked by my African colleagues often. And so today I'm going to provide 3 points. I would like to provide my perspective, understand the critical mineral. And so I want to provide some facts to explain why some accusations about China are not fact-based. And as an environment lawyer, and a community lawyer, by no means do I aim to defend the Chinese government or corporate actors. However, I think the facts are important for the stakeholders involving the critical mineral supply chain or value chain to decide the next move. I will start from the first is understand what price China has been paying to be the mineral refining and battery making dominating power. And I'm showing this picture here. You see this community. I visited this site. This is Rashi mine. It's a copper and cobalt mine owned by a provincial company, Jinchuan, from Gansu province in Lubumbashi, DRC. I visited site last year, September, and you see this high, like mountain-like rock, pile rock. It's open pit mining, huge, very good. And certainly you see I saw the children and people are climbing on to that pile of the rocks to dig rocks. And there are certainly a lot of environmental issue, human rights issue. There are access to clean water and the dust and the security issue around the mining. And next. Here is another country in Africa, and you see this very muddy and dusty mining road cut across to many villages and their home. And it's a bauxite. One of the mineral we haven't been talked here is it's not considered as a critical minerals by some stakeholder or some organizations or scholar, but it is one of the strategic mineral under China's categories. And here you see the women have to go very far to fetch water. They used to have the well in their village, but now they have to work very, very long to get them. And this is a picture showing the community has been affected by China finance mining project in Africa. What's missing here, or I cannot present, is what the community at the other end and the community in China. And they're living along the battery making site and the refining site. And once I heard about the podcast run by a DC-based think tank and this China observer and China specialist, and she said mineral process cause pollution, and China as a country has been willing to suffer the environmental consequences. Is it true? Is that fact Chinese people are willing to drink water with heavy metal, eat rice with cadmium, and breathe air with PM.2.5 particle? It's not the fact. So the community in China are also suffering on this China's dominating power, being the number one processor of the minerals and battery producer. So I want to provide this fact, this community on both ends, the upstream and downstream are suffering. And so this is from being a community lawyer, I would want to provide this fact. And look at China, the water crisis happened in end of the 2022 in Yichun, Jiangxi province. The city was called the capital city of the lithium, and with a lot of lithium refineries, and it had a water crisis in 2022. So Chinese government has facing social conflict caused by the manufactured pollution in the past 3 decades, and the environmental challenge will be ongoing after China met the carbon peak and the carbon neutrality goals. And so my second point goes to what did the mineral-rich global South country want? What did China offer, and what did the Western country failed to do and could do better? I have talked with many community members near the China-financed mining sites in DRC, Guinea, Zimbabwe, Ghana, South Africa, Sierra Leone, Ecuador in the past 8 years. And here's what I learned from their demands. And they need community-owned infrastructures, make their life easier, road, bridge, sewage system, health clinic, fair compensation for land, access to water and land, access to electricity, a fair share of the profits from the mining jobs. And they want international investors who understand their culture and willing to communicate with them. And local government in those countries want tax, jobs, and infrastructure project. National government, they may have a different request, but overall, they have their own demands, understand their demands, and provide the solution to them. I think that is the solution in this great power competition, and China should not be the only one target for Western power to win this critical mineral rush. So I want to give you a decode China's mineral plan, starting back to 2008 to 2015. Critical mineral is not a Chinese term. You couldn't find the origin term in Chinese, and now we do have a translation called 关键金属, but it has never been in any of the official government documents. In some years ago, it has been translated from Western literature. And in 2008 to 2015, it was called important minerals. And China do make the 5 years plan, national plan, and underneath the national development plan, there are various systematic 5-year plan. Here is a national mineral resource plan. And then from 2016 to 2020, and changed to the name strategic mineral category. In the previous slides, you see the lithium was not even in that the category, important minerals. But by the time 2016, lithium is, and I list other minerals considered important to China. They call it strategic mineral category, and iron is still considered the most important strategic mineral to China. So understand China, you have to understand what Chinese government is thinking, and not only on lithium, but overall how China consider which natural resources are important to China's economy. And recently, you see China put more emphasis on those minerals. China are not have an advantage on position, meaning those China has less 10% reserve, global reserve, and lithium is of course, lithium, cobalt, nickel are those among those minerals China paid the most importance to. And I want to stop, I think, how many minutes?
Maybe just one more minute.
Okay, so I want to list the company names. Many times when you point out China, you see Chinese companies, but you didn't make it specific who they are. And they are from different sectors, and they're not all Chinese government backed. No, here, the most active Chinese company on the critical mineral value chains are private owned. And they include CMOC, and Zijin, Huayou, and Qingsan, and Tianqi, and CATL. And very interesting, I want to point out the CATL and CMOC. Both these two private companies are named in their Chinese names totally different. Named after the city they are founded. And they have the English name and Chinese name totally different. And they are, those Chinese private companies have the flexibility and get innovated to expand along the value chain of the critical mineral, not the state-owned. And
to just connect that to the Chilean case, the 3 of the companies on there are involved in the Chilean context. Tianqi is the one that has bought about a quarter of SQM, the Chilean lithium company, and the 2 other ones, Qingsan and BYD, are the companies who have agreed to build processing plants in Chile as a condition to get access to some of the lithium resource.
Yeah, of course, SOE is the state-owned enterprise at the backbone of the Chinese economy, and any of their move will be indication to see how China as a country or government pursue the direction. So you see the China Mineral Resource Group Limited, this is the newest central government-owned mineral company was set up in 2022. And the first mineral, these companies try to build on the assets is iron, not lithium. But of course, I think lithium, cobalt will come. And so the SOE's way is you see the resource-backed infrastructure deal commonly used in Africa. I don't know if it's the case in Latin America, but in the two countries I'm heavily involved in DRC and Guinea, this is Chinese government provides build infrastructure project, and in return, they get mining. But I didn't say I support that. I know there are so many issues around the resource-backed infrastructure deals. But I think important is understand the host country, I mean, the Chinese investment or any international investment, host countries, their own need, the resource rich but economic poor country, what they want. And that is a solution we should seek for. I will end here.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so moving on to our last speaker, Gracelin. You're at a major think tank in DC and involved in these debates on U.S. policy to counter China and to develop U.S.-oriented supply chains. So what do you see as the key issues for our audience to understand in that area?
Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Sabrina, for inviting me. I apologize, I got in at 3 in the morning, so I will try to speak English, but I did miss the morning session, so I hope I don't repeat anything. So I want to make 5 points in terms of how Washington is looking at critical minerals. The first part of it is that it's extremely bipartisan. I always say if there's 2 things in Washington that are bipartisan, it is that critical minerals are really important and that we're uncomfortable with China, which bodes very well for me as a mining economist. My job security isn't going anywhere. And when we think about it, Trump issued the first executive order back in 2017 on critical minerals, and then Biden did number 2 in 2020. And a lot of the financial resources, feasibility studies have gone out of both administrations. So, I think that, mining is a long-term game, and what's been a disadvantage for us is that we just got to the game late. We closed our Bureau of Mines in 1996, and we never reopened it, which is part of why we lean into our allies so much. Mining in the US accounts for about a little more than 1% of GDP. It's 15% in Australia, which is why we lean so much into countries like Canada and Australia, because they have projects, they have processing, and importantly, they have the workforce development that we didn't have. Now, I do a lot of briefing for members of Congress and Hill staff, and one of the observations is that everybody wants to know how to do it, and we don't really know quite how to do it. Which takes me to my second point. Some of you may be familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act, which was really designed to be a domestic industrial strategy to facilitate the clean energy transition. And one of the requirements in the IRA is that, right now to get the IRA tax credit, you have to source 50% of your minerals in the United States or a free trade area country. And then over time that increases. By 2027, 80% must be sourced. But in December, we also added, so that was seen to be a demand, try to create a demand for electric vehicles. But at the end of last year, we also released our Foreign Entities of Concern guidance, which essentially says that to qualify for the Inflation Reduction Act benefits, you cannot be from a foreign entity of concern, which is North Korea, Iran, Russia, or China. But you also can't be in a third country like Peru or Chile or Australia and be owned by a company that has ownership of more than 25% Chinese ownership. And that was really designed it was a signal that we want a demand signal, but we want to demand, a supply chain that is independent of Chinese control. People often ask me how we might see this change under the new administration. I work with a lot of the people from the former administration because we are an independent think tank. We advise in both directions. And one of the things is that the foreign entity of concern guidance may be tightened. And what that means is that two things. First of all, eventually you may see that 25% ownership go to zero. And the argument is not that you can't trade with these some of these countries, but you won't use taxpayer subsidies for mines owned by these countries. But the second thing is you may see a tightening in what currently is a lot of loopholes. So for example, at present, MMG is a Australian, they have a big office in Australia, but their parent, there's a Chinese ownership requirement behind there that ultimately you have parent companies, you have loopholes, you have companies, you have ownership that's been handed off for subpar. We have merger and acquisition data to say that it's sold off for far below mine value. So you're gonna see a little bit more scrutiny applied to that. Which takes me to my next point is the U.S. has started to use economic diplomacy, which I would maybe retitle minerals diplomacy. Historically, a lot of the ways that we've engaged with these countries is through aid in Latin America, USAID being a primary vehicle. But now what we're starting to see is other economic diplomacy instruments. So for example, look, free trade agreements are like the most politically fraught thing in Washington. We're not gonna pass more. But critical minerals agreements are being looked at. So for example, we did have one with Japan, which essentially means that for that 30D tax credit in the Inflation Reduction Act, it's essentially a free trade agreement for critical minerals and battery parts only. Now that was under significant controversy, but not for the substance of it, but because it didn't go through Congress. It was signed by the executive. And if you wanna know the fastest way to piss off Congress, it's to bypass Congress. So we learned from that. We learned that you need to go through Congress. So that would be my kind of point in terms of using economic diplomacy differently. Mineral Security Partnership is designed it was a US-led coalition with 13 countries about how to engage abroad. We'll pretend this is under Chatham House rules, so you can't say I said this, but it's a great wine and dine club. These are the best parties alongside mining conferences. But one of the controversies of the MSP is that it hasn't actually had the muscle to move investment. It's been more of a signaling tool. Another signaling tool we had is the tripartite alliance we signed with the DRC and Zambia to build that regional value chain. You haven't quite seen the investment move with that, which again is one of the challenges. 2 points. The fourth one is we're starting to form new friends. So for example, we've seen in the last year, China, you've probably heard, has rolled out restrictions, export restrictions, gallium, germanium, graphite, rare earth separation technology. An electric vehicle, I'm from Detroit, love the auto industry, spend a lot of time there because my mom lives there. And one of the big things there was a Federal Reserve in Chicago event I spoke at, and Tesla was there, your big GMs, your Ford. And your average electric vehicle is about 210 kilograms, which I don't know, about 500 pounds or so. And 66 kilograms is graphite. A conventional vehicle doesn't use any graphite. We have less than 1% of graphite. China processes 90% of graphite. They cut us off of graphite. You see now how we have a dilemma. But what we have done is start to use US financing vehicles to build those. So we did a $150 million loan through the Development Finance Corporation, the US government international financing arm, to a graphite project in northern Mozambique. Which is in a high conflict zone, but we need graphite. So we're sometimes willing to turn a blind eye to things. But then what we did is we used a Department of Energy financing for the graphite processing facility in Louisiana, which essentially sends graphite from Mozambique to Louisiana. So we're starting to use US government instruments to rewire global supply chain. There's a lot of entities in absence of a coordinated Bureau of Mines. You have State, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, Department of Interior, which is where USGS sits, Labor, et cetera. And I think my last point on this would be that the biggest challenge we have in Washington is when we look at China and when we look at the Saudi, we have a very active state who does a lot of these investments. A guy that formerly worked at Alcoa, Bob Will, is actually the CEO of Ma'aden, which is the Saudi state-owned mining enterprise.
That's part owned by Alcoa.
It's part owned by Alcoa, and you see a very active element in there, right? you have to be incredible to get 14,000 people to Riyadh for a mining conference. And that's what they did in January. A lot of us were sitting in Riyadh, which is dry. You know, there's no alcohol there. You can go get people to Cape Town. You can get people to a lot of places. No alcohol. I mean, that's pretty impressive. But the challenge we have is that mining investment is low right now. We are at a 3-year low in mining activity. Exploration, financing, discoveries, all of this. Why? People always ask, why are prices low? And the economist in me gleams. The reason is this. Interest rates are high. If you were to buy an electric vehicle, you would buy it at 3.5% interest, not 7% interest. So we are not buying stuff, which is pushing our prices down. At the end of the day, that's the point of an interest rate hike, is to get people to buy less. The second reason is China's economy did not rebound the way that we thought it would. At the start of 2022, JP Morgan came out and said we are at the start of a commodity supercycle, which is when prices stay high for 10 years minimum. We were eating our own backsides on that statement within 6 months because interest rates went up 11 times. And so what's happened is prices are low, and so what we're doing now is we're partnering with countries like Saudi, which when Biden came in, we were very cold with Saudi. But what's happened over time is prior to this Israel-Hamas deal, we were actually looking at partnering with a $15 billion deal, funding 2 nuclear plants in Saudi, because we have come to the realization in Washington that we need to partner with India, we need to partner with Saudi if we want to counter China. And that normalization deal has not come off the table. We've put it on ice until the Middle East settles down. So we have seen new friends. So in conclusion, I think the mining sector now looks very different. I started 11 years ago in the Platinum Belt in South Africa. When I was there was really very little international cooperation. It was a very fragmented industry. But over my 11 years in the mining industry, we have seen it completely change. I mean, I thought my career was dead from mining, but now it's like, again, it's the most sought after sector in Washington. So it's a transformed industry. It's an exciting time to be in it. And Washington is trying to figure out how to work to create an enabling environment for the private sector in the absence of necessarily directly investing in it. Thanks.
Excellent. All right, so we've covered a lot. Now we're going to move into the sort of round robin questioning period. Since we have more panelists here, I'm going to actually say the initial questioner gets 90 seconds and the 3 commenters get 45 seconds. And I will be strict. So there's really just a chance to comment, and then because we want to save time for questions, because I was from the audience. Okay, so let's see how this works. Okay, so Ernest, you're talking about trade-offs and choice, which I think has been well established in your comments and earlier. So what do we do about this, right? We have to move forward. You know, one choice is not doing anything on climate and not moving quickly enough into this space, right? But then you also talked about the trade-offs within if we head into critical minerals. So how do we handle this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is certainty and is transparency. I mean, we have a law in the United States right now that's governed mining on federal land since 1872. It was designed in the years after the Civil War to encourage development of the U.S. West. We are sitting in the U.S. West right now. It's pretty well developed. And so the law has done its purpose. The law has some quirks in it that do irk some conservationists. For instance, a mining company that operates on U.S. federal land does not pay royalties. Oil and gas companies that operate on federal land do pay royalties. And one of the previous speakers on the morning panel was speaking about sort of the economic rent and the concept in Chile of this. And, you know, I mean, mining companies in Chile would probably kill to not pay royalties to the government, but companies that pull copper out of the ground here in the United States don't pay royalties to me and you as taxpayers. So having more clarity on the rule of law, getting to a yes or a no, every time and time again when I was reporting out this book, whether I was talking to conservationists, environmentalists that oppose projects, or mining industry executives that want to develop mines, they all are very confused as to how exactly you can get to a yes or a no. Like Ann was saying, you know, some of these projects can go on for decades. You know, when I visited a proposed underground copper and nickel mine in northern Minnesota in 2022 for the book, they gave me a mug that celebrated their 10 years. 10 years of what? Like they hadn't gotten anywhere yet. So I still have the mug if anybody wants it. So that's a critical supply. And when we have each site face opposition, that adds up. And I've probably gone over.
That's exactly right. Right at the right time. So thank you. So let's go down the line.
Yeah, I agree with everything he said. I would add to that, folks probably saw the big article this week about we're running out of electricity. And it turns out when you electrify everything, you use a lot of electricity. So this means not only does it take decades to get stuff out of the ground, it takes decades to run power lines. And then there's the whole like power lines cause wildfire thing. So there are a lot of different parts in that chain. And if we're going to make the choice to address climate change, we've got to address permitting for the mines, for the power lines, for everything.
Perfect timing again. Let's go on.
So the big debate is not in my backyard, which is called NIMBY, and better in our backyard, which is called Bobby, and this is a debate that we have a lot. I think the big trade-off that we have is that there's human rights, there's environmental rights versus needing the critical minerals for national economic and energy security. And right now, I mean, the debate is how to balance those things. I think with the current administration, they lean a little bit more into human rights and environmental security, but that could change as a trade-off in the way you balance that with the next administration.
Wonderful. Jingjing.
So I think build a community-centric solution and understand resource host countries true need and provide solution to those countries. That is a way to go ahead. Yeah, that's.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to pose a question to Anne, and then I'll ask for maybe comments, maybe start from Jingjing and go this way afterwards, so just to prepare you. So Anne, I want to ask you how you think about what companies should do in this transition. What do they need to understand and they need to do better on?
Yeah, companies have not always been the best actors, right? And I'm very aware of that, and a lot of really responsible companies are really aware of that. And so what we know now is that we've got the tools to do better. Ernest talked about IRMA, the kind of Tiffany-backed mining certification program. A lot of specific minerals and materials have certain mining certifications. So in aluminum, which is my background, there's the Aluminum Stewardship Initiative, where you have full supply chain traceability, and you can actually measure the impact at each point of the supply chain. Importantly, this covers not just environmental behavior, but also working with indigenous communities and with communities that typically haven't had the same voice that other people have had, to ensure that their voices are heard and that they give free, prior, and informed consent to anything that happens. So that has to happen.
Great, thank you. So Jingjing, why don't we go down? What's your opinion on that? What do companies need to do better?
Of course, regarding Chinese company, they have a lot to improve. But first of all, I think the Chinese, those good policies, so-called Green Belt Road Initiative policy, should be updated and should be to be laws with enforcement. And so far, we haven't seen China put strong measures on the Chinese companies for their overseas operations. There is no reporting requirement and no legal consequences if they violate host countries' environmental human rights laws. So all those the policies need to add legal enforcement. So that is one. And of course, Chinese companies need to respect the international human rights norm, complying with host country laws. They have a lot to do. They need to understand the global order. They are not running their business within China, so they have to apply international norms. So this is what I think. We need to take a more nuanced perspective, look at how Chinese company perform. In some countries, those countries with quite a strong rule of law and good governance, Chinese company can perform better than they perform in those countries with very weak institutions, like in some Western African countries or Central African countries. So yeah, that is why my expectation to our I hope our Chinese government can make policies to laws and Chinese company comply with laws.
Great, thank you. Yeah, please.
So our biggest pinch point is less production and more midstream processing. And so one of the things companies need to reckon with is the fact we host roundtables with Department of Energy with kind of early startup processing companies who are looking to establish operations, so domestically oriented. So there's two things companies need to do is they need to acknowledge that there's a long-term nature to this investment. You don't build this overnight. So for a mine or a processing facility, you can easily look at 5 to 10 years from startup to production or processing. And companies need to engage with foreign governments. Most of the resources, if we have 1% of graphite, we need to source our feedstock from abroad. So companies need to acknowledge that they have an active role to play in working directly with foreign governments. It's not all a US government effort.
Great, thank you.
And I would say bring your local or host community on board quickly and early. Many examples in my day job and also when I'm reporting on the book where this wasn't done and it had hurt the companies. One in particular was a company that wants to develop a large lithium deposit just outside Charlotte in North Carolina. This was a company that was based internationally in Australia. It decided to move its headquarters to North Carolina, decided to, sign a contract with Tesla, decided to go to Wall Street and try to get a bunch of money, all before it told any of the local county commissioners what exactly its plans are. So you can imagine that did not engender any goodwill.
Thank you. All right, great. So you all are doing excellent on time. It's incredible. It's incredible. So,
We want to beat the first panel.
okay, so my third question, this goes to Jingjing to start, is what do we need to do with regard to local community issues, right? You know, you had an interesting conversation with some of the folks in Congo where they wanted the development benefits of the minerals, but they also obviously didn't want the labor and environmental problems. So how do we deal with this?
Yeah, I think understand there are two needs and demands. This is the first step. I think many times if we're sitting in China or in US, we put our interests in the center. And so that's come back to the question, critical to whom? And for African community, critical minerals are not critical to their daily life. And they need electricity, and they need the road, and they need the job, and they need to make a living. They need access to clean water. So those are their needs, and understand their needs, provide, no matter China or US, provide what they need. This is the solution. In US, I have to say, the roads I have been on in Zimbabwe or in the airports in African country, most of them built by Chinese companies. And how many roads and bridge and built by Western countries. And this is, you have to look at what Western countries fail to provide to the community in those difficult situations. And both China and the Western power need to provide, understand the community needs and provide. They want not only put their own interests. Of course, I think each country put their own interests in the center. But in this, the battle or rush or whatever on the critical mineral, you need to understand where the minerals are. They are in the global South countries. And their community have their own needs.
Thank you. Yeah. Gracelin?
So social license to operate is regularly rated your #1 risk. Ernst & Young has done a survey every year of what are the biggest risks mining companies face. It's that social license to operate. You needn't look further. Panama, Peru, South Africa, pick your country. There's two things that quickly is, one is you need to go from a consultative process. We've always been very good at we talk to our community, to a more participatory process where they're part of that formation. And the second thing is that's actually a really good form of non-financial de-risking. Currently now, if you're thinking about the banks or governments, they're knowing that's a risk. The last thing you want is a stranded asset sitting in a country because they stopped production. Nobody wants to be First Quantum in Panama right now. And so going through that process adequately on a community by community basis actually de-risks the entire investment and is what used to be a nice to have is now a must have in our business model.
Great.
Yeah, completely agree there, and I'm going to specifically highlight the importance of working with indigenous peoples, that's the global term, and with tribes here in the US. It's hard to overstate the damage that's been wrought and the opportunities that can be gained for everybody by engaging communities, and especially engaging communities that have oftentimes been in those places for decades. I think I'm thinking of a few different examples where a company has, for instance, been given the technical right, the legal right to mine in a certain area, but then the company I'm thinking of in particular experienced severe blowback because they then started the blasting process, AKA blowing things up, and started blowing up 50,000-year-old ruins. And sometimes you can have the legal right to do things, but you really just shouldn't be doing them. And so I think companies really need to focus on and invest in and sincerely come to the table to engage Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and I would just say, maybe just building on what Gracelin said, reaching out to the community now is a must-do, and there's also not just one party you would speak to in a community. The Resolution Copper project that we were referencing earlier in the panel, there you've got 3 or 4 different groups that are all at odds. Yes, you've got the Indigenous tribe that is strongly opposed to it, but then you also have a town that is primarily Hispanic, that is very democratic, voted overwhelmingly for President Biden, and wants this mine to open. And so, having to navigate all of these different constituencies and speak to them is a situation for that company to navigate through. And so, oftentimes just the realization that, it's not just sort of a direct, but there's multiple parties and multiple interests.
Wonderful. So we have one last question for the panel. So get ready for your questions, and we'll call on you in just a moment. Yeah. So the last question is for Gracelin, and then we'll start over here and go down. So again, you're focused a lot on these efforts to reshore and friendshore. Is this the right direction, and are there things that could be done better?
Yeah, we don't have a choice because our friends don't have all the minerals that we need. So we're kind of going to a point where we're making new friends. I mean, if you just think of high-level numbers, between Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia, you have 75% of the world's platinum, chrome, and manganese, half the world's cobalt, over 40% of graphite, 60% of lithium, and a significant amount of rare earths. If I look at the US, sure, we have Mountain Pass, but we actually only have about 1.5% of the reserves. We produce more, but we have less than 1.5. So the big thing we're doing now is I look at a country like Brazil that has about 18.5% of the world's rare earths, but they only produce about 0.5%, less than 0.5%. So there's a lot of untapped reserve potential. So they're a great new friend, if you ask me. So it's really starting to think about the fact that our historical economic diplomacy instruments, namely free trade agreements, were not ever designed in the era of critical minerals. Morocco is the only country in Africa that we have a free trade agreement with. I don't know if you know, Morocco doesn't have a ton of minerals. So we need to rethink the instruments that we're using in our effort to make new friends. And then the last thing, to Anne's point earlier with resource nationalism, is we have to start to invest in more parts of the value chain than just production. We need to invest in processing, which is your workforce development, requires workforce development, energy infrastructure, water infrastructure, et cetera. So it is kind of new friends, new instruments.
Great, thank you. Yeah, please, Ernest.
Yeah, I would definitely just build on that by saying it's going to be extremely important to look to allied nations. One thing, though, that I run into time and time again as I talk to people, though, is right now the instruments are confusing. As Gracelin was saying, perhaps these free trade deals were not the mechanism by which to do this. It's not, for instance, Argentina right now does not have a U.S. free trade deal, but it's a huge lithium producer and it wants to grow further, and there's a major U.S.-based company that produces lithium there. Is their lithium IRA compliant? They say yes, but if it's yes there, then why isn't cobalt from the DRC compliant? So it's these sort of confusing things that I think need to be figured out in order to boost this onshoring need.
Yeah.
I'm going to go in a totally different direction, and I'm going to say we need to invest way, 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 way more in recycling. And what do I mean by this? I do not mean the container you have in your house. If we think about a car, minus a couple of things you take out, the car is literally stuck in a shredder, like a paper shredder, and shredded. And so then what happens is different parts of the car are taken, and you'll have different alloys. Like with aluminum, it'll be alloyed with zinc or copper to get specific properties. They'll look at it, they'll be like, let's just melt it all together. So you get this like garbage aluminum that's used in engine blocks, newsflash, not used in EV cars. So what are you gonna do with all that garbage metal? We need to invest in changing how we manufacture so that things can be pulled apart and recycled more easily. We need to invest in purification of metal, so you can take that garbage metal and turn it into pure metal you can use again. And we need to improve sorting so that you can do a better job of sorting out those alloys. And what I'm seeing right now is there's investment in electric vehicle batteries, and there is virtually no investment in seriously talking about a recycling capacity. We need to start mining our garbage dumps.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Jingjing.
Yeah, I think the U.S. needs Western developed countries what they can provide to the resource-rich countries, provide what China cannot provide, and so build that competitiveness which China does not have. For instance, increase the country, host country, or the investment host countries' governance, help them increase their natural resource governance, rule of law, and use the U.S. On good practice, accepting public comments, like citizen approach, and apply those approach to the host country, the African country, and Latin American country. That is what you can counteract with China, which China cannot provide.
Excellent. I think we should just give the panel a round of applause just for effectively executing that. That was impressive. Okay. So that's terrific. So let's go to questions. Audience, I think we had one in the back there, and then we'll go here second. So whoever has the mic, maybe hand it over there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mine is not really a question as such, but
Let's make it a question, though, rather than a comment. Please, you ask a question. Okay.
Sir, can you please, you give me 2 minutes to talk, okay?
No, this is a Q&A session.
Okay, what I'm saying is this.
It should be a question, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is this. What I say is that I concur with the lady from the China, because what the big issue we have is because of the Western power of grabbing everything in Africa. If you hear of cases of the coups in West Africa, these are countries which were colonized by the French, by the France, and when they come there, they do mining, they take everything, they leave people in a state of poverty. Chinese came. If I leave this country here, I'm sorry, you said I asked questions. I will land at the airport built by the China. I will ride my car at a very powerful superhighway, very nice, built by the China. China, you scratch my back, I scratch your back. They do investment by mining the minerals, and they develop those countries. It's not only Zimbabwe. Even my country, the airport
Are you from Zimbabwe?
So what I was trying to say that the West.
Yeah, if I maybe could change that into a question then.
Okay,
so,
I'm changing, yes. The West need...
Sir, we need to phrase this as a question. This is not a time for giving speeches, okay? So if I could change this into a question, what I would say is,
okay,
your suggestion is that China is bringing development to these countries, and that is a benefit to these countries.
He's saying, what can the West do? He's saying what...
Yeah,
he has a question.
Okay.
That's what I'm going to do, sir.
Okay.
I'm sorry to tell you that's my first time meeting you, but I don't like the way you moderate the meeting. Because you have some kind of dictatorship tendency, which is not good, okay? So what I'm saying is, what is the West doing in order to address the issues of dealing with the indigenous? If we take into consideration of what the 7th president of the United States, Andrew Jackson, did to the Indian Americans when he defied even the court order, the Supreme Court of 1831, under the Indian Removal Act. So what I'm saying that the West needs to come up with the issue.
Thank you. I think one of the things, I mean, look, I'm not the U.S. government. I don't claim to be. I don't want to be today. But the big thing that I think the U.S. is doing is we're starting to see more infrastructure investments. The theoretical counter to the Belt and Road Initiative, number one, is the Libido Corridor project, which goes to the Angola port, number one. Two, Power Africa, which Obama set up to double energy access in Africa, is our prime way of doing it. There are 600 million people in Africa without power. In 25 years, 1 in 4 people will be African. We acknowledge that global prosperity is linked to African prosperity very closely. We are working on the US government is working on those investments and creating an enabling environment using blended finance. I'm not saying we've done it right historically. We have forgotten to show up in many of these countries, but I would say that there is a little bit of credit due to where we are starting and making progress.
Would anyone else like to respond to that? Jingjing?
I understand what you would want to say, and I totally understand. But as a community lawyer, I said we should put the community needs in the center. Right now, I see the U.S. Policy or Chinese policy, they put their own government, the state interests in the center, not the communities. That is where the problem from. And I hope both China and the Western country can improve on the solution they consider providing to Africa or Latin America.
Anyone else? No? Okay. Thank you. Yeah, we have a question over here, and then two more in the front here.
Thank you. I wonder if, I know we're talking about critical minerals and about the technology that we're using today. I wonder if you could just briefly, with the experience that you have, talk about where do you see this going in the future? I hear a lot of talk about solid-state batteries and batteries using different technologies and using different minerals. And I wonder if you see any of this changing the need for the types of critical minerals that we're struggling with right now.
Go ahead. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question, you know, and when I was talking earlier about, like, do we need 13 times more lithium or 42 times more lithium, I think that's where that comes into play. Short answer is we don't know yet. Longer answer is there are battery technologies and other types of technologies coming up rapidly behind lithium ion. And a good example would be sodium ion, which has a really big benefit, two benefits. One, it doesn't require as many critical minerals. It's much more things that are readily available. And two, it doesn't explode as much. And so that's a big benefit. But I think what we don't know yet is how much are you going to have the sunk costs and the sunk infrastructure of the technology you choose versus the sodium ion battery coming in behind or some other technology coming in behind and ramping up. We are seeing companies like BYD spending significant money to invest in big sodium ion production. So I do think it's an open question of what's going to end up winning.
And I would just add on to that, just historical context. It was like the early 1990s when everyone started to discover this thing called like a Walkman, like that Sony was doing, and you could recharge the battery inside, and that was what, 30, almost 40 years ago. And it's taken that long for mass adaptation for this thing called the lithium-ion battery. I mean, it takes a long time for things like this to ramp up, and so sodium is promising, but is it going to replace the battery in my cell phone in 5 years' time? No.
Can I add one point to that? I think the U.S.'s strategic advantage is that we're capitalists, so we do research and development very well. So at present, the IEA has said we can meet 10% of our future demand for key minerals through recycling. I hope in 5 years that's not the case, number one. Two, cobalt. I mean, I think there's a reason that people are hesitant to sink a brand new cobalt mine in, because remember, a life of mine is 20 to, it can be 80 years. And we're aiming to not need cobalt in the next 5 to 10 years with our batteries and the way that they're moving. So these trends are also reflected in kind of market dynamics, is that, the U.S. had its only cobalt mine last year. It opened and closed because of prices. But that was a brownfield investment for a reason. It wasn't a new mine. So the market is following R&D, but R&D is a very exciting dynamic space.
I think we had two questions here, and then we'll come to the right. So maybe here, and then okay, and then we'll go over here, and then
Yeah, hi. My name is Noah Tobias. In the interest of full disclosure, I work with Jingjing. And I had a question I think it's primarily addressed to Ms. Clawson, although anyone could feel free to hop in. And it's about certification schemes. So we work in Guinea, we work on bauxite mining with companies that are either provisionally certified or are trying to get certified with the Aluminum Stewardship Initiative. And one of these companies is called CBG, which Alcoa owns a significant stake in. I'm not sure the exact percentage, but I think
22.5.
There you go.
Approximately.
CBG has been provisionally certified by ASI, but I've spoken to community leaders who were impacted by CBG's operations. I've spoken with nonprofits that work on CBG. And in the certification process, auditors came to Guinea, but they did not engage with communities. The dates of the audits were not publicized ahead of time, so communities couldn't, discuss to prepare what they would say to CBG. The evaluation on which, that ASI used to provisionally certify CBG has not been publicized either. So we don't know why that decision was made. The company itself identified which villages auditors should go to speak with community members. And I also want to add that broadly, in my conversations with community leaders, they said that auditors seemed more interested in paperwork, in the process, than they did in the actual lived experiences of impacted communities. So I guess my question is, how do we ensure that a certification scheme like ASI, like IRMA, actually addresses community needs rather than just being process-oriented?
Yeah, that's a great question. And certification standards are about 30 years old. I want to say they started with paper products, but someone, let me know if I'm wrong, I think it was FSC and SFI. So first off, I would say that, state the obvious, I don't think that's supposed to happen. Right, that's not the way the process works. These are typically supposed to be open consultations and consultative periods, and I won't get into the many-headed hydra of a joint venture that's owned by a government and several companies. But I will say that those companies that are part of the joint venture would be good folks to reach out to in the event that this type of thing happens. More broadly, talking about certification, yeah, certification is exactly as good as the organizations that are running it and exactly as good as the auditors that are running it. And you're absolutely right that auditing for these types of certifications, and this is true, for all you who are going to be lawyers or who are lawyers here, this is also true for anybody doing ESG disclosures inside companies. They also require auditing, pretty significant auditing. And you need good auditors, you need good fact checkers to check the auditors, and you need to have good parties doing it. I will say that the folks at ASI are serious about what they're doing, and they're not intending for this to be specifically paperwork, and that's largely true at other certification schemes also. But they require staying on top of, and at a certain point, they require some goodwill from all of the different parties involved, and when that's lacking, it's as good as the people who are working on it. The other thing that I would note is it's important to distinguish between types of certifications. China's getting pretty serious about climate, and we haven't gotten into that here, but one of the things that Chinese companies are also doing is they've come up with their own certification program for their metal, and it takes about a week to get. So I don't know what the auditing process looks like, but it's real fast. Maybe not super comprehensive. So I do think you've got to judge things by their quality. But I would absolutely encourage anyone, especially when you're in some kind of legal compliance role, to ask those tough questions and make sure that everybody's doing their job, because that's not what's supposed to be happening.
Any other thoughts on that?
I just say, I'm really fascinated by IRMA, which is why I wrote a whole part of my book about it, because it's designed to have all of the players, whether you're an indigenous group or a labor union or a mining company or an investor, all of them are in the same room making mining standards, and it's designed for complete transparency. And so that's what I found really, really interesting. Like, nobody wants to buy an engagement ring that was made by atrocious conditions, that platinum came from atrocious conditions, right? Not Volkswagen, for instance, is extremely paranoid about buying lithium that's made at low ESG standards. And so IRMA is the way this is designed right now, and if it grows, I'm curious to see where it'll go.
So we had a question here and then here, yeah.
Okay, just a little bit defense of China.
Oh, use the microphone, yeah.
A little bit defense of China. I understand it's not just China in Africa. From 2019, Wagner Group, Russian group, went to Africa, Mongolia, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and they they did agreement with African government in those states to protect government from, when there's a situation kind of military situation get tough within Africa, Russian Wagner group steps in, military groups, and protects African government. But in lieu on that, they got mining, refining. That's violation. I believe in this violation of the local people, communities, because it's violation of antitrust, it's corruption within government. Wagner Group operated in Africa from 2019 by World Bank research. By 2026, they're planning to leave African continent and invest $1.6 billion in the local natural resources of mining and refining. My question to China now and US, as you stated, Ms. Jian, also that it's a problem in the United States right now in China to complement regulations, laws, for Chinese companies, for African government or Brazilian government and US government. We need rules, we need regulations, we need education, and we need listen communities. Question to China. I know that China now is very interested in Mongolia, investing in Mongolia right now. And question to Washington, D.C. Do you look
Never
at
been called
this?
that before.
They're not representatives of.
Never been called Washington, D.C.
What does that make an anime?
First question.
Where do you leftovers?
Yeah.
Where do you live?
Do you look at this trade mining contracts or interest also in Mongolia with China complement together? That is not going to be antitrust violation in Mongolia, or maybe, you know, there's some will be agreements between US and China together go to Mongolia and work with Mongolian government. Since Russia leaving also Africa by 2026, investing in their own land, are you interested to move more to Africa now, take Russian mining territories and complement and implement in the right way with African government and help citizens, right? To work together, to improve their rights, to improve their, style of living, the pollution. I think that's my question to you.
Okay.
What US will do by 2026 when Russia leaves Africa and mining and refining?
Okay.
Thank you.
First, certainly I'm not here on behalf of the Chinese government. No way! Don't call me China. I'm Chinese citizen and a China-trained lawyer. I work for community. I work for defending our planet. So that is where I stand for. I'm not, by no means, work for on behalf of Chinese government or Chinese companies. But in order to answer the question, I did see this pattern. Chinese company bought mining sites from previous owned by Canada and Canadian company or US companies. And for example, there's one mining site in DRC bought by CIMOC, Noyang Muye, from Freeport, American company. This is a pattern. I have been seeing it. Many countries have been visiting. I could see Chinese companies are willing to take the risk, and there is no pre-screening process in China when they request the Chinese government approval or register their investment. There's no pre-screening process, no human rights due diligence process. And so those Chinese companies can, no matter the private or state SOEs, they can take the risk to buy those mining already in the big trouble. And that is the pattern I've been seeing. That's why what I mean is strings the law regulation in China and make the human rights due diligence and the environment impact assessment as a required process when Chinese central government or provincial government approve those overseas projects. That is what I have been advocating for 10 years. And I see some progress, not enough at all.
I'm not Washington, D.C. either. My driver's license is Michigan, and I plan to keep it that way. So I may not answer your question, but I want to add just a little bit more granularity. So Saudi Arabia has identified the mineral super region, which is actually Africa through the Middle East to Central Asia. So there are many representative government ministries from Central Asia at their Future Minerals Forum, which they have prioritized for investment. The U.S. obviously does not invest directly, but by partnering with Saudi, they have also prioritized the mineral super region inherently, number one. Two, the mineral security partnership, it may not be moving very fast, but if you read everything that comes out of it, it's really pushing for a responsible set of mining with transparency. And there's a hesitation at this point to work with governments that don't have those standards in place. And then my last point would be that, like, look, I think China has made progress, but China has also really hurt some African countries. Angola is still fighting with the debt that was done after the Civil War in 2002. They can't pay it off because it's resource-backed. So they were paying it off fine when oil was $115 a barrel. When it dropped to $55, they went into a recession for 5 straight years. There's a reason Angola has partnered with the U.S. on the Libido corridor. We had a state visit from the president. It's gone both ways. I mean, there is a desire to work with other models because it hasn't always worked. So I think with Central Asia, there is a key acknowledgement. Biden has talked a lot about the importance of Central Asia, but it is, again, it's the start. So we're going to watch it play out and partner with other countries to do that.
I think the one thing I would say, because you're right, maybe Russia has gotten off lightly in this panel, is that the sanctions against Russia since Russia's invaded Ukraine have had a pretty big impact on minerals markets. Not as big as folks would like. I think the bigger impact was when Oleg Deripaska was sanctioned in 2018, which just shut off a lot of trade in minerals completely. But what we're seeing is that Russia, which produces 10-ish% of a variety of different metals and minerals, is being cut off significantly from global trade in an effort to get Russia to change and improve its behavior. And that's also impacting its ability to invest in places like Africa, because so much Russian money is unable to flow in the global financial system.
Great. So we have about 2.5 minutes left, so I think we have time for one more question in response.
Thank you, Anne, for your comment on garbage dumps, because earlier this morning in the panel, Jennifer mentioned that we should not be taking anything from the garbage dumps. Are any of you familiar with or are aware of any policy research or conversations focusing on mining landfills? And can any of you envision a future with changes in global supply chains that would incorporate resources mined from landfills?
The short answer is yes, but also how do you define a landfill? Is for the mining industry, it's a tailings pile, which is just it's been sitting there for hundreds of years in some cases, and it contains a lot of critical minerals. So we're seeing a lot of leaching technology being used. Freeport-McMoRan's a big user of this. Rio Tinto, I know Codelco has been looking into it, using either chemical leaching or bacterial leaching, and the idea is you basically, not to be, too basic, but it's a giant pile of rock, and you pour the stuff on top of it, and then it filters down, and then you take it out and process it. And that's a great way to increase. I mean, I think Freeport-McMoRan says that they think they have 100 million pounds of just copper sitting in tailings. And so that's a staggering amount. That basically means it's 100 million pounds of copper that's just been sitting there on land that they've owned for decades, and they don't need to get permits or anything for that. They just need to filter that out. And so that's a tailings a pile right there. That's a waste pile. I mean, in terms of just recycling electronics, I'm fascinated by where recycling will go. I think there's a huge increase in the need for R&D around that space, and it'll only go. But it's staggering when you think about how many old cell phones you probably have in your drawer at home right now, or old charging cables or whatnot that need to be reused. We don't have a lot of infrastructure or policy support around EV recycling and EV battery recycling, and I'm curious to see where that'll go from Washington's perspective.
Can I add one point to that quickly? Is the only mining company the U.S. government has an equity stake is called TechMet. And shameless plug, we're hosting Brian Manel, the CEO, for a fireside chat that's virtual. You're welcome to dial in. But one of the things they have in South Africa is a rare earth recovery project. So openly, Brian is South African. He's based in London. He'll tell you they would never make a greenfield investment in South Africa. It's a very volatile mining climate. However, the recovery project is something you're seeing a lot of investment go into, and the U.S. government continues to increase its equity stake in Tecma. So I think there's a lot of future in that approach. Again, given to what Ernest was saying, is that there's just a lot of minerals sitting there to be used.
I think the very final point I would make is that China put on restrictions. They don't want the world's garbage anymore. And in 2017, they put a law into place basically forbidding us from sending our garbage to them, like our electronic scrap to them. So this is going to become a much more urgent need because the garbage disposal that we had been using is gone.
And the last point,
Yeah.
very quickly. In China, we do have the legal requirement we call the ecologic restoration of the mining. And I hope that regulation can expand to the Chinese overseas investment. So far, it hasn't. And in Africa, this is what the needs U.S. and other Western developed country can provide, the technology and the standard, and to help African country to build better regulation on the mining tailings. And that is a space where the Western power can fit in. China hasn't in that space yet.
Great. Well, let's thank our panelists for a very informative discussion. All right.
Thank you.
Good job. Good job. Thank you. Yeah, that's terrific. Yeah. Yeah. That's good.
All right, thank you everyone. We're gonna take a 10-minute break while we set up for the next panel. If you wanna step outside and get a beverage, and we'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you.